What is the effect of the explosion in the White House among Trump, Vance, and Zelensky? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principal case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, I should have said professor of economics at the Citadel, but you're not wearing your Citadel uniform. What's up with that?
I'm at home today.
Oh, the lax life of a professor.
Do we want to talk about the lax life of a foundation president?
Oh,
I don't think you're in the office.
oh no, that's right. Let's change the subject real fast. All right, Richard, let's talk about the big, let's say, should we call it an implosion or
Oh yeah.
explosion at the White House? Kind of hard to tell. I'm referring, of course, to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine's visit to the White House, where he met with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice president, and everything was going along, nice and harmoniously for, I don't know, 45 minutes or so. And then all of a sudden the explosion took place that, or I should say the explosion heard around the world, where the whole world is just like aghast that this type of thing took place. And it would seem that it has placed in jeopardy any further funding of Ukraine, which would be a good thing. If only the U.S. government would adopt the libertarian paradigm of just ending all foreign aid to everybody and stop intervening in everybody else's affairs. And in other words, adopt the founding principle of non-interventionism on which our nation was founded, where George Washington said, forget alliances, entangling alliance, or Jefferson said it too, with other nations, and forget the perpetual antagonisms against other nations, and just focus on building a model free society here at home. But in any event, I thought there's several interesting aspects to this controversy. Let me just put one in context, and then I'll hand it over to you. One was that Zelensky had to know before he came to the United States that he is not a popular guy in the eyes of Trump or J.D. Vance, who's going to be on Trump's page. I mean, Trump had accused him of being an unelected dictator, which is at least half true. The guy won't hold elections, claiming that the war prevents him from holding elections. I've never been able to understand that, why soldiers on the front lines can't fill out a ballot and give it to their commanding officer and send all the ballots back to the counting station. And does he exercise dictatorial powers? I don't think there's any doubt about it. Hardly any president that's in a war isn't exercising dictatorial powers, but he was offended by that. But the one of the big points Trump made before Zelensky's visit was that Ukraine had started the war, and that's a statement that shocks the world, because there's been this mentality of Russia aggressed. Russia was the one that did the invading, and that's where history starts for everybody in the mainstream press and the Washington establishment and the NATO countries. The history of this conflict starts on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. So it's aggressor, aggression. Russia's an aggressor, and that's the official narrative that has been sold from the very beginning and continues to be sold. And yet it's really much more complex than that, because if you look at what NATO was doing when at the end of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact dissolves, the U.S. officials promise Russia that NATO is not going to expand eastward. And in my opinion, NATO should have just dismantled as well. Just when the Warsaw Pact ended, NATO should have ended. I mean, the purpose of NATO, the ostensible purpose at the beginning, was to protect Western Europe from a supposed attack by the Soviet Union, who had been devastated from World War II. I mean, their entire industrial capacity and finished. I mean, the thought that they were going to invade Western Europe to me is kind of inane, especially since they knew that the U.S. would come to their assistance, and the U.S. was the only nation that had nuclear weapons and the will to use them against populated cities. But in any event, at the end of the Cold War, for me, this Cold War dinosaur should have gone out of business. But at the very least, they said, no, we're going to stay in existence, but we promise we're not going to move eastward, which is precisely what they did. Decade after decade, they began absorbing former members of the Warsaw Pact, getting inexorably closer to Russia's border. And people can say, well, Russia's paranoid. Russia's paranoid. They shouldn't have worried about American troops and German missiles getting ever closer. But I mean, let's not forget that what the devastation that Germany had wreaked on Russia. So there's kind of one can understand a paranoia, at least with respect to German troops near the border. But in any event, it's the same mindset that the U.S. had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That okay, you have the right to put these missiles there. Cuba is a sovereign, independent nation, but we really don't like it, and we're going to invade if you don't remove them. And so that as they were moving eastward, there is no doubt that the Pentagon, the CIA, the national security establishment knew exactly what the reaction was going to be, because it was the same reaction that took place back in '63 when the tables were turned. So when NATO threatens to absorb Ukraine, which enables U.S. nuclear missiles to be placed right there on the border, the predictable happens. The same thing that the U.S. would have done had the Soviets maintained their nuclear missiles in Cuba. Russia invades, and that's where their history starts. It doesn't start with all this before. Well, I've often said, what would cause a president of a country to make that choice? Zelensky had to know that Russia was going to invade if he insisted on joining NATO. Uh, Russia had been saying that's what they were going to do. And so here's a guy, Zelensky, that says, well, I'm going to choose war over this thing of joining NATO. So it's never been a fight for freedom as such. It's a fight for the right to join NATO. Now, did he have a right to join NATO? Of course. We all know that under international law, it's a sovereign, independent country. But as a practical matter, he knew what was going to happen, just realpolitik. And he chose to have his country virtually destroyed to the point now he never could have done it without U.S. assistance, lasted this long. And the choice, of course, of having all these Ukrainian men dead and the whole country destroyed was just to join NATO. I mean, that to me is absolutely phenomenal and disgraceful. So I think when Trump says Zelensky started the war, he obviously didn't start it in a technical sense because Russia was the one invaded. But I think it's important that we put things in a larger context of the role that NATO played, and in my opinion, the role that the Pentagon, the CIA, the national security establishment played in engendering this crisis. And let me just wrap up this little introductory statement by saying, let's not forget that when the U.S. when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, one might have said, "Oh, well, the U.S. provoked this," and to which somebody would respond, "Oh, conspiracy theory, Jacob." But then Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor, many years later, confessed that it was the U.S. that provoked this. They planned it. They wanted it to happen in order to degrade Russia, or as Brzezinski said, give Russia its own Vietnam. And when you look at Biden's statements of trying to get rid of Putin, or the statements that U.S. officials were making about degrading Russia, they're referring to getting Russian troops killed, the army decimated in order to reduce the power of Russia. And so I don't think we can really just airbrush out of history the role that the U.S. empire has played in this debacle. What do you think, Richard?
Well, you raised a number of things, so let me deal with a few of them in a sort of unorganized order. First of all, about elections. Zelensky insists that it is impossible to hold elections for the president, which is now a year behind when they were supposed to be held, or more than a year now. But let us recall that just as a comparison in the United States during the American Civil War, the U.S. government, the Union government, Lincoln's government, was at war. Uh, Yet, to my knowledge, congressional elections were held in 1862, and obviously a presidential election was held in 1864, which resulted in Lincoln's reelection. Now, it is true, obviously, it was Southerners did not vote. Well, they were in rebellion. In their own eyes, they're a separate country. So, besides them not voting, being allowed to vote by Lincoln's government, technically they wouldn't have eligibility to vote in their own eyes, since they now chose to be a separate confederacy. But the fact was is that an election was held in the Union states, for both Congress and the presidency. That would have applied to all the territories, and I assume they must have tried to, given the voting eligibilities back in the middle of the 19th century in America, soldiers at the front line, I assume, had some way to do what today we call absentee ballots. And so an election was held. There was a national emergency. Lincoln had even suspended habeas corpus and all the other stuff. Elections were held. So I see no reason why, in the current situation in Ukraine, the Russians hold approximately 20% of the territory of Ukraine, defined by the borders before the Russian invasion. Well, that means 80% of the country is not occupied. It is quite possible for elections to be held there in, quote, the normal way. Ukrainians, who are admittedly now number millions, who are living abroad, well, citizens of other countries often can vote in their own country's elections, even though they're not present, through either a write-in ballot or voting at their country's embassy closest to where they're currently residing outside of their own country. And as far as the front lines, well, in an imperfect situation, you can still try to have ballots to as many of the frontline soldiers as is, technically possible given the circumstances. So, however imperfect, and we always know that there's imperfections in any election to one degree or another, a vote can be held to determine the presidency of Ukraine. So I consider this bogus. The other thing I would like to touch upon is, your point is that, when do you mark the beginning of a conflict? There's admittedly, it's a controversial one, but there's a parallel to modern U.S. history preceding the attack on Pearl Harbor. Is it true that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Yes. Did they therefore, in the military sense, initiate a conflict between America and the Empire of Japan? Yes. But why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Because the United States, for over a year, had imposed oil and related other material embargoes on Japan. We would not sell oil to the Japanese. We pressured the Dutch, who were the colonial power over what today we call Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, not to sell oil to the Japanese. We had imposed restrictions on the exportation of various steel and other material to Japan. And we were basically giving them an ultimatum. If you want these embargoes lifted, you would have to completely withdraw from China. Now, again, Japan had invaded China, and they've been fighting this war since 1937. And it is very clear that, without a doubt, in that part of this world war, the Japanese were the aggressor. They invaded China for their own nationalist purposes. But the point is, the U.S. was saying, we will not lift our embargo restrictions on you unless you withdraw from China. And from the Japanese point of view, that was unacceptable. Now, from a classical liberal libertarian point of view, thinking about how countries and people should act, was that the position that Japan should have had? Well, no. But as you were saying, you have to deal with the reality of what goes in the minds of political leaders and what motivates governments. The Japanese were not going to withdraw from China just because FDR told them to. And they had 6 to 9 months of oil and other essential material before Pearl Harbor, or they were going to run out. So they attacked the United States, militarily at Pearl Harbor, with its devastating effect in causing 3,000 American lives, or approximately. But the fact it's because of the policies initiated by the US against a country with whom it was not at war that pushed the Japanese into a corner in which they decided that this was the only course of action to try to loosen this thing, occupy Southeast Asia, and get access to the resources, including the oil in the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. So when did the war start? What initiated the war? How did it come about? Well, the same thing can be said, as you were saying. Yes, the Russian army invaded Ukraine territorially in February 2022. But why? What were the preceding political strategies and machinations that made Putin in the Kremlin, given his worldview, his conception of how he's defining Russian national interest, that this was the only recourse to which he had to prevent a situation which he considered too damaging to Russia, as he's seeing the world, And it was basically, beyond anything else, NATO. It was clear that there was anger and resentment and a sense of betrayal with all of the Eastern European countries being absorbed into the NATO alliance. And then to want to extend it to Ukraine, this was sort of a breaking point, particularly since they viewed the US involved in the overthrow of an early Ukrainian government to put a pro-Western president in. So as a consequence of this, this was all seen as an attempt to move closer, to have an alliance where the US has a tripwire that if Russia was ever to then attack Ukraine, it's immediately going to war with the United States and every other NATO member. And that it was viewed as too much of a threat. So what's next? Are they going to try to institute one of these rainbow or color revolutions like it occurred in Ukraine and had been done in the Republic of Georgia? So in Putin's paranoid mind, he was the next target to try to instigate an undermining of his authority and his government through an attempt to arouse demonstrations and resistance to him. And therefore, what the United States government, given the real world, set the stage where Putin decided this was a course of action. Now, did he have overconfidence? It's clear that they thought that they would invade Ukraine, and in 3 or 4 days, a week, they would be in Kiev. They'd overthrow Zelensky's government, put in their own puppet. There's no doubt about it, right? He wasn't going to hold democratic elections. He was going to put his own puppet in, and it backfired. And now he himself has gotten into a 3-year war in which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been put into a meat grinder, of which he really doesn't care about human life. Okay, but the point is, what initiated this? It created an international tension between two major countries because the United States was like poking the stick through the bars at the bear, a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, creating this situation. And Biden just fed into this. Biden took this traditional American view that it's our duty and destiny to play policeman of the world, either directly or indirectly. And the indirect version was to just fund the Ukrainians with as much material and financial support as seemed reasonable step by step to basically keep Russia at bay. And as you were saying, to grind down the Russian economy and to grind down the military capacity of the Russian government. Okay. And finally, there's the situation is that what about Trump's very proposal of this deal, that indirect support for Ukraine through this rare earth and raw material arrangement? This itself is a form of interventionism, is it not? Who's making this deal? The United States government, to have access to Ukrainian raw materials and rare earth materials. So even if the US is going to use private companies to do a specific contract, the US government is carrying out a socialist policy. The US government will have control of this. The US government will decide who can apply for a lease or a contract to be the actual developer of these raw materials. So in fact, Trump is in fact being a mercantilist, where it's the U.S. government gaining control of other sources of material to bolster the U.S. economy and its defense capacity, for which they need a lot of this railroad. So in fact, Trump is not being non-interventionist. He is being his own way a foreign interventionist through economic means.
All right. Well, you've raised a lot of good points. It's interesting that you go back to World War II to place a deeper context on this. As you were talking, I was thinking about Poland, that when Hitler was negotiating
Mhm,
with the Polish leaders with
mhm,
respect to the Polish corridor and
mhm,
what had happened in World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, um, Poland, just as a practical matter, was a much weaker country by that time. And when you're in a weaker position, relatively speaking, your negotiating terms change. That you understand as a practical matter, you're not as strong as the guy next door,
mhm,
and so maybe we ought to consider what he's saying with respect to access to the other part of Germany that had been separated by this Polish corridor.
mhm,
But as soon as Great Britain comes in and offers the guarantee that we
mhm,
will guarantee you that
mhm,
if Hitler does anything bad to you, we will come to your defense.
mhm,
Now the negotiating stance of the Poles changes completely. We got the
mhm,
British Empire behind us. We don't need
right,
to compromise.
right,
And so then Hitler invades, and now Britain comes in, declares war, World War II starts. No, and Britain knew the whole time that they didn't have the military capacity to stop Hitler.
right.
And then, as you and I have said many times before, at the end of the war, it was ironic that, okay, yeah, Poland got freed from Nazi tyranny, but spent the next 40 something years under communist tyranny. They didn't consider World War II to be the big victory that the US and Great Britain did. But you can see parallels that with Ukraine, that Ukraine, if without US backing, might have sat there and said, you know what, joining NATO maybe isn't really worth it because we're not going to be able to stand up to Russia by ourselves. And so, okay, maybe we better just relinquish this dream of being a member of NATO.
Mhm,
But I think that Biden and the national security establishment made it very clear to Zelensky before that Russian invasion that don't worry, we will come to your assistance if this happens. And they had already been involved in training exercises with the Ukrainian armed forces. The Pentagon had. They'd already furnished them armaments. And so it's reasonable to believe that there was this under the table guarantee we will come to your assistance, which totally changes the stance that Zelensky's going to make because now, just like with Poland, he's got the guarantee. He's got what he calls the security assurances that the U.S. is going to be there to back him. Not directly, because we know that would have meant nuclear war, but indirectly through flooding them with armaments. The other thing that I'd like to point out is what Trump has done is upend this whole Cold War mentality, though, with this anti-Russia mentality, where he's clearly moving in the direction of normalizing relations with Russia, lifting the sanctions and just normalizing things, which has shocked the world of Western Europeans, the Democrats, many of the Republicans. This is
mhm,
the mindset that has existed in this country since 1947, or actually 46, 45, even before the end of the war. This we've got to hate the Russians. We've got to hate the Russians, and this is what gets our national security establishment justified, and that the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. I find it fascinating that Trump raised this notion that, well, not a notion, this that when they came after him the first time he was president because they believed he was a Russian agent, and all of that nonsense of, oh well, we're going to have impeachment because we believe he was an agent of the Russians, sort of a Manchurian candidate for the Russians, and the Robert Mueller obsession, that he was going to find that Trump was an agent of the Russians. He brought that up. And even to the extent of he was saying that Putin was part of this victimization too. When they were accusing him of being a Russian agent, they were essentially accusing Putin of having retained him as a Russian agent. And I think this would be a really great thing, Richard, to upend this whole Cold War racket mentality that has existed for so long in this country, and really in the larger context to restore a non-interventionist foreign policy where there's not this perpetual antagonism against Russia, against China, Iran, Cuba, whatever, that we bring all these troops home, including from Western Europe. They've occupied Germany long enough. I mean, World War II ended a long time ago. Bring all those troops home and restore this country's founding principle of a non-interventionist foreign policy and not this perpetual antagonism against China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, or any other country in the world.
I can add one other fact that has come up in these debates and discussions, and that is the inviolability of the territorial boundaries of countries. That somehow these are sacred and ethical and moral. But what have determined these boundaries historically? Let's take you raise the instance of Poland at the start of the Second World War. Well, in 1939, Poland had boundaries as a country. Where had these boundaries come from? Well, before the First World War, Poland had not existed as a separate country. That's because at the end of the 1700s, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had carved up Poland and grabbed chunks of it, and Poland as a separate country disappeared off the map of Europe. So at the Treaty of Versailles, declaring Germany as the aggressor, they stripped territories from Germany to make the new western boundaries of the reconstructed independent Poland. But where did the eastern frontier, the eastern boundary of Poland come from prior to 1939? It was a ceasefire line. A ceasefire line from what? A war that had been going on between Poland and the new Soviet Russia, Lenin's government, between 1919 and 1921. It was basically a ceasefire line. It wasn't an agreement. There was no inviolability. It's just a ceasefire line. So then when Britain and France declared war against Germany in the face of the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, they talked about the inviolability of Polish boundaries. But those boundaries themselves were created by an imposed peace treaty on Germany and the ceasefire line of a war between Poland and Soviet Russia. What makes that inviolable, especially in the context that at the Yalta Conference, Poland wasn't sitting at the table, but their border was changed again. Stalin kept most of what he grabbed with his deal with Hitler in 1939, and they just moved Germany west to the Oder-Neisse River. So what makes boundaries somehow sacrosanct? The tragedy.
Stalin was a better dictator than Hitler. Remember that?
Yes. My wife was just making an editorial comment on the sideline from the peanut gallery that's only because Stalin was the nicer and kinder and gentler dictator than bad, evil Hitler.
10 times more than Hitler.
That Stalin killed 10 times more than Hitler. But who's counting, right? Who's counting? But the fact is that what makes these boundaries now, the tragedy is that the borders of countries have more often than not been the result of wars and conquest. And from a classical liberal libertarian point of view, that should not be the basis of jurisdictions. People should have these freedoms to decide. And I've written about this before of self-determination through plebiscites and votes to determine what country you want to belong to, whether you want to belong to a different country, whether you want to establish a new country. And with a laissez-faire world where borders no longer act as hindrances, what would it matter where the borders are, as long as people have a freedom to decide the jurisdiction they want to live under? But the fact is, tragically, borders have no basis other than war and conquest 99% of the time. What determined the borders of Ukraine when Ukraine became an independent republic with the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, the dissolving of the Soviet Union? Well, those borders of Ukraine have been set up artificially by whom? Stalin. When with Soviet Russia got reorganized under first Lenin and then Stalin as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, these 13, quote, republics. And it was basically the Communist Party in Moscow that determined the borders of each of these Soviet republics. What made those boundaries sacrosanct? Particularly since they were arguing about ethnic national identities of the members of the Soviet Union. Yeah, Western Ukraine was basically Ukrainian in terms of culture and language. But Eastern Ukraine, where most of this fighting has been going on, was linguistically and culturally Russian. And these linguistic Russians were just put into the same Soviet republic with Ukrainian speakers because borders drawn by Stalin. Well, what makes that sacred? So the point is that the idea that the borders have to return to prior February 2022, or going back further because of Crimea to 2014, is just an absurdity. Because unfortunately and tragically, borders are determined more by the misfortunes of war than supposedly moral German determination or any even free vote of the people living in these areas.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm glad you cleared up one mystery, and I'm sure the viewers were having the same concerns that I was. We didn't know whether you were smiling at your dog as you turned over in that direction, but now we know it's Anna that you're smiling at. All right, and at the risk of I know we're about out of time, but at the risk of doing a major digression here, you've raised this point about the sanctity of borders, and I think it's important to remember what the U.S. government did in the 19th century with the U.S.-Mexico border. And that we've talked about this, but it's worth emphasizing that you've got two separate countries, Mexico and the United States. And the United States provokes a war which will enable them to take over the entire northern half of Mexico and absorb that country with a new border. And they don't see any problems with that. In fact, it's kind of ironic that Trump has now issued an executive decree establishing English is the official language of the United States, including in the northern half of Mexico that the U.S. had stolen. And in fact, there's still people in Mexico, I've talked to them, that still have this dream that they're going to recoup their country because it was their country until it was stolen and the boundaries were redrawn. And I also wish to point out that when I was recently on a podcast discussing open borders, there was a guy that said, "Don't you realize that Mexico invaded Texas?" Well, Mexico never invaded Texas. What he doesn't realize is Texas was a northern province of Mexico. It was part of Mexico. And Texas secedes, declares its independence from Mexico. And everybody in the United States says this is a wonderful thing. This is a wonderful thing. But so secession is a good thing until the Confederacy says, well, we're going to secede from the United States and we don't want to be part of the United States anymore. Oh, no, we have to go to war to prevent secession, to keep the original boundaries of the United States intact. Just a little bit of hypocrisy that I thought I'd throw in here at the end.
Well, I would just sort of say, how far do you go back? If we ask the question, why did Mexico have the borders that it had before the Mexican War of the 1840s? Well, there had been a king of Spain, and conquistadors came over and defeated the Aztecs. And their armies proceeded north, and their explorers, and laid claim to California, to what we now call Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico and these other areas. Well, did the native Indians who were living in these areas suddenly say, we've just been waiting generations to be made subjects of Spain? Why couldn't it have come earlier? I mean, let's be serious here. It's the tragedy of power, political power, and military conquest and wars. And so how far do you go back? I mean, the fact is all borders have these arbitrary bases having nothing to do with freedom and democracy and the choice of residence. And borders will change again in the future as they have in the past. These way tragically, as a great misfortune, but it's just the reality. And to suddenly say, well, as of day X, all borders are sacrosanct, sounds nice, but it's not the way the history of the world has worked and is likely tragically to work in the future. And that includes what happens to Ukraine.
Well, based on what you just said, are you saying that the first people that came over from Russia into the North American continent, the very first people, that we should be searching for their descendants because that's who the United States really belongs to?
Now let's remember, as libertarians, we believe in John Locke's notion of natural rights and first settlement, right? If it's virgin, unclaimed, unoccupied land, the first settlers have justifiable right. So I guess we have to go back to the descendants of those, what, 1,000 years ago, those Siberian Eskimos who crossed over into Alaska. And oh my God, they have a right to everything. Oh, you mean I don't have a deed to my house here in South Carolina?
Well, you might be one of their descendants, so don't lament.
Yeah, look here. Don't be smiling. There goes your house in Northern Virginia.
All right. On that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, as always, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Come and visit us at FFF.org. If you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily and our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and tune in, to, of course, to Libertarian Angle. We'll be planning another online conference and via Zoom. And then there's also my new program, Trump Watch. Richard, as always, I enjoyed the visit. Talk to you next week.
Until next time.